Hello, everybody. My name is Anthony Davies. I am the founder and chief executive of DuRoss Consulting, and it is my pleasure to bring to you this interactive discussion session on the subject of the lasting COVID-19 impact on cell and gene therapy. I would like to thank the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine for bringing this together, and in the face of a global pandemic, still convening what I feel will be a very valuable conference. My only regret is that we're not going to follow this discussion panel with the customary adjournment to the bar and an adult beverage or two, but we'll put those in the bank hopefully for next year when we'll be doing something very similar to this, except in person. It's my pleasure to introduce the panel today. I am going to ask them to introduce themselves. Wilson Bryan, Curran Thompson, Amy DuRoss, and Tim Schroeder. And so to start off, I would like to invite the panel to give a brief bio and introduction and expression of their areas of interest. I'll start with Wilson Bryan from the FDA.
Yes, I'm Wilson Bryan. I'm Director of the Office of Tissues and Advanced Therapies in the Center for Biologics. I am a neurologist by training with specialty in neuromuscular disorders. At the FDA, the Office of Tissues and Advanced Therapies regulates a variety of products, including cell therapies, gene therapies, and plasma protein products, such as hyperimmunoglobulins.
Thank you. And next, I'll turn to Curran Simpson from REGENXBIO.
Hi, nice to meet everyone. This is Curran Simpson. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at REGENXBIO, which is a small gene therapy AAV-based company in Rockville, Maryland. We have around 6 or 7 programs in clinical development as we speak, and many licensees utilizing our technology across the industry. My background is in chemical engineering and spend most of my time in the manufacturing process development area.
Thank you, Curran. Pleasure to introduce old friend and colleague, Amy DuRoss.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amy DuRoss. I'm the CEO and a co-founder of Vineti. My background really, first and foremost, is as a patient advocate. I got my start very early, testifying before Congress, beginning at age 8, continuing into the current day. But our program at Vineti, we have a platform that orchestrates workflows, and chain of identity and chain of custody is entirely focused on cell and gene therapies. And so we're very fortunate to work with both clinical and commercial products in market today.
Thank you, Amy. And finally, Tim Schroeder.
Thank you, Anthony. This is Tim Schroeder, CEO of CTI. CTI is a full-service clinical research organization that we started 21 years ago. And we specialize in full-service study management with an emphasis on regenerative medicine. So we have typically about 36 active programs in the cell and gene therapy. So I'm looking forward to participating today and appreciate the invitation.
Thank you, everyone. Well, you know, about 10 years ago, it seems, when we last had in-person meetings at Meeting on the Mesa, you know, everything's changed. It was around about March, April of this year when we all started realizing that we were going to be living in a different world for at least a short period of time. And I think most people feel that we are and we will be living in this changed world for longer than we initially anticipated. Short-term impacts, medium-term impacts, long-term impacts. We're meant to be talking about the lasting impact, but I'd like to kick off with a discussion of one of the first impacts, and then perhaps you can reflect on that individually and express how it may or may not, how that impact may or may not be lasting. Hospitals in many parts of this country and the world did start to become overwhelmed. Some were overwhelmed, and very quickly most clinical trials, I'm picking my words carefully here, and you should take issue with my words as appropriate. Most clinical trials basically shut down really fast. And then things bottomed out and stuff started opening up again. We're in a situation where I see something approaching normalcy, but for this extended period of a quarter or two, not a lot happened in clinical trials, and for the purposes of this discussion, cell and gene clinical trials. And so there is, I think, a demonstrable hiatus, and this really has impacted organizations such as all 5 of our organizations around the table. I think if we're talking about clinical trials, first I should go to Tim Schroeder, who, last time I checked, you ran clinical trials for a living pretty much. So you should have a pretty, I think you might have a good global assessment of this issue with some nuancing there, probably that I'm missing from my very high level summary. But also, this is your lifeblood. So how bad's it been, Tim?
Well, it's been very interesting, Anthony, and I think your comments are right on mark. In some ways, for us, we've got associates in about 60 countries. So we started to see the impact in Asia as early as January, and then in Europe, maybe late February, early March, and then in North America, Latin America, later as March unfolded. And then, of course, we did start to see some good things happening, for instance, in Asia in May, June, July, August, where things did, have some level of recovery. But I think you hit the nail on the head with your comments is, for the people who don't do clinical research all the time, they probably don't have a great view for the longevity of our studies. And I think all the panelists, obviously, especially Dr. Bryan, can appreciate this, is a lot of our cell and gene programs are 5-year, 10-year, or even 15-year commitments. And so in many cases, with the active studies, and from a CTI perspective, we usually have about 150 active trials. And this is largely, after subjects have been enrolled, after the treatment has been performed. Maybe there's some chronic therapies, but in a lot of cases not. But you're just trying to keep these subjects in the study, trying to have a valuable data points. Maybe it's MRIs, maybe it's lab tests, maybe it's resupply of drugs, things like that. That was a huge challenge, as you accurately pointed out, especially in the springtime. I think everybody had to be very creative about that, and I'll be really interested on the panelist discussion going forward, because I think some of these studies are going to have gaps. And the question is going to be, how do sponsors, how do regulatory authorities, and how do companies like ourselves, how do we try to fill those gaps as best we can, knowing it's not going to be perfect? So I'll stop there, because I'm sure others have other comments to potentially add in.
Yeah, I think we'll probably come back to that. It's a good segue, to Wilson Bryan at the FDA. You're still swamped, though, right? I mean, you're not exactly looking for things to do, even though you must have seen it happening. I think, Tim, probably you saw it first, partly because of your organization's global reach, but you must have seen it pretty soon after that, Wilson, right?
Sure. The pandemic in tissues and advanced therapies, we also have responsibility for regulating immune globulin products. And so with the pandemic, we received a flood of inquiries and applications related to hyperimmune globulin products and related to cell therapies and products that are derived from cells, and not so much activity, particularly in gene therapies. And we were stretched thin before the pandemic, and with the flood of work that came in, it really had an impact. Sometimes folks don't like to admit this, but we all know that we've had delayed meetings. We've had really to delay review of some applications because giving priority to the pandemic. And we're just now starting to get some balance and it will take us some number of months to catch up. So it's been a struggle for us.
And we'll come back to more of the struggles the agency's been having soon. Amy, you in no small measure are also involved in helping providing the tools to run clinical trials. How did you see the swoon downwards, the bump along the bottom, and then the gradual recovery?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Wilson, in our universe, even with all the demands of the pandemic, hats off to the agency, because we have not noted major delays in new IND reviews or amendments, which is obviously a critical gate. But I know that you are stretched incredibly thin. Your team is doing amazing work. But for the universe that we serve in cell and gene therapy, we've been remarkably and just impressed at how much you've been able to keep pace, really genuinely. I would say, I think we've noted more than 25 affected trials. I think, again, really trying to limit it to the universe that we deal with on a daily basis. But I would say, obviously there are many more than that. On the positive side, as we kind of, we descended to the bottom of the trough and then began to ascend back up on the other side, we have seen an increase in the adoption of telehealth and e-systems to deal with distributed care and other health data. So that forcing function of the pandemic, I think on the positive side in clinic, the world is rapidly much more ready to meet the needs of advanced therapies from an operational perspective, really in the clinical side, notwithstanding all the tensions and the stressors that the pandemic is forcing. I think on the positive side, we're seeing a renewed emphasis on alternative and more holistic ways of caring. The other thing that is happening, that some of our MDs have been redeployed, but are now back in their areas of specialty, including oncology. So, naturally there was a prioritization around COVID care. We're seeing that, specialists are starting to retreat back to their clinics and be able to have more time to focus. Apheresis centers, obviously for autologous therapies, aren't being overrun by COVID, or often in separate locations from primary hospital settings. So that key, and also the key stress point as we're beginning with remdesivir and other therapeutic approaches to begin to address patients earlier and try to prevent intubation. And ICU capacity is leveling, so I think hopefully that trajectory increases as we move into the fall and winter here. But I think that key stress point, because of CRS and our concern and need for access to ICU beds in our field, we're seeing improved ability to treat COVID-19, reducing that ICU capacity issue as well. So I do see some positive. I do feel, at least for the moment, we're sort of ebbing into the other side of that trough. I hope that continues.
Curran, you're actually developing therapeutics. You're the one of us who's actually developing drugs. But you're not just developing. You're developing a portfolio of drugs, which are quite dissimilar. So I guess I can't really ask you to paint with too broad a brush and say, how did it affect your whole program? How did it affect each of your therapeutics? Was there big differences, or was it pretty much across the board?
Yeah, I think there's significant differences across different indications, some of which use immunosuppressive therapy as part of it. There was a great deal of anxiety around sites that would perform surgeries. First off, are they open or not? And second, would parents of these children that are treated give consent for fairly invasive surgeries in some cases? So the ultra rare and rare programs, I think, struggled probably the most. And the other indications, like our retinal programs, I think fared pretty well through this period. one area I would call attention to is all of the INDs that we're submitting for different programs rely on preclinical data, and sourcing test models for studies, and just every lab that we're working with, including our own, are probably running at about 50% of capacity because we've done safe spacing within the labs and worked sort of in shift arrangements. And add that all up, it leads to delays in preclinical work and also reporting of that work, which has been something we've had to work around over the last few months. But I do see the recovery, and I think people are learning to cope. We do things like surgical training on video now, where we never did that before, and it's been quite successful. So we are adapting to new ways of working, which I think some of which will continue on when we're done because they're actually more efficient.
Yeah. And you're at a small biotech now, but I know from your background, you've done your time at GSK and HGS and bigger places. Do you talk to your friends in the larger organizations? Has their experience been broadly the same as yours?
I think so. I think some of the, maybe sometimes a little bit less at risk, and this is more putting on my manufacturing hat, because most of those companies have their own internal capacity for manufacturing, whereas the small companies often suffer more because they're running virtually. And I think we'll talk about it later, but when that capacity seems to be evaporating quickly, the impact to a larger organization is less severe. Now, moving materials, whether it's API or finished drug, between countries is a significant challenge. It has been a significant challenge. So those kind of disruptions are more and more common at a larger company where you have international trade going on.
Yeah, I think the international issue is one we'll come back to a couple of times during this discussion. I think, from the FDA's perspective, Wilson, you must be seeing some significant adjustments in filing, in timings for filings, some scrambling to really people to figure out when they are going to file, when they're going to data lock, when if they're waiting on last patient in, and so forth. Are you to what extent is the FDA being active, and to what extent are you being passive and just letting your sponsors figure out their needs and go to you, or is there prospective outreach from regulators in this country at least?
At the moment, we're hearing from particularly, cell and gene therapy is something that big pharma is just now starting to touch on and get into, and most of our development comes from small drug companies and academicians, and the small drug companies are really struggling to survive, I think, financially, to get through the pandemic and continue development. And we're hearing a lot about their struggles to stay afloat and continue and finish off their development programs, and whether or not those development programs are going to be sufficient to meet regulatory standards. So we're working with them on a individual basis, because the issues are different from one indication to the next, as far as what's necessary for meeting regulatory standards. And with that, I want to build on something that Amy said, that there are some positive things coming out of this pandemic with regard to drug development. Just as hospitals have been flooded, doctors' practices have had to change. So the practice of medicine is changing toward televisits, and we're seeing more and more interest in developing methods to do remote outcome assessment. And that means we're going to have to develop new outcome measures and validate new outcome measures that can be captured remotely. This will be, I think, an important boon for cell and gene therapy, where so often we're trying to treat some very rare diseases and disabling diseases. And it's often difficult for those patients to make it to clinic visits. But if we have an energy now to develop outcome measures and validate outcome measures that allow us to reliably capture information from patients in remote locations, that will ultimately facilitate development and help us to bring products forward for these rare diseases. So I do think that there are positive things coming from this pandemic as well.
May I also may I just quickly jump in here if it's okay? Wilson, I did also want to just pick up on one of your points about the immense economic challenges presented by the pandemic, of course. I will say also on the positive side is the sector raised 10.7 billion globally in the first half of this year. That's more than all of 2019. We have now more than 1,000 companies. We've broken a milestone in the sector, more than 1,000 companies working in the space. All of this is thanks to ARM data, by the way. But you know, I again, and not to undermine the real challenges of mounting trials in this environment and keeping companies afloat. I still think just the underlying conviction that we're seeing from a growing number of investors, and I used to be in venture, so I am quite tightly connected with many of them. It's only growing despite the pandemic, and really the view is and the question is, what's the window of time to resume as much of the new normal, again, with some positive impacts that you were just touching on as well, Wilson. But I don't see any lack of overriding interest in the sector. I see an acknowledgement that we're in a recessionary environment, and there are real economic challenges we face. So again, not to undermine those. However, the investment continues, and I'm only seeing new investors drawn into this field as the mechanisms of action are iterating in excess of Moore's law. So I'm very bullish still, despite the real challenges that we're facing immediately in the economic environment.
I agree with that comment, Amy. We track raise and closing of funds pretty closely here. I think we dug out a statistic that April of this year, April fund closings were exceeded the entirety of 2019 in the biotech sector, and they were big funds. $1 billion plus funds there were many of them, not just a few. Which is great. And I think what's interesting is, and I'll open up this commentary to Amy again and to the rest of the panel. I think that obviously a lot of the heavy lifting for these raises had been done before the pandemic hit, but the funds were announced after there had been more than enough time for people to get cold feet and pull out, more than enough time. Now, we'll never know if there would have been even more if the pandemic hadn't hit, but it was a heck of a lot as was. And I think my initial poll of selected client CEOs in the early months of the pandemic, everyone had been asked by their board of directors to push out the burn a little bit further, just almost as a matter of course. And I think that chief executives who just closed a round at the beginning of this year, that's one thing. Chief executives who had been intending to hit the street in May or something, that was a different conversation, because obviously they'd run down the checking account a lot more. I think though there has to be, eventually we're going into some form of a global recession, whether it meets precise metrics for what is or is not a recession. And everybody agrees that the financial engine has been dealt a pretty good thumping over the last 6 months, and we're far from out of that. So at some point there will be less money sloshing around in the system. I think Wilson's, you've probably been exposed to a lot of those companies with an unfortunate cadence to their fundraising, which put the need for fundraising right on top of today. But I think everybody has to be, they may not be worried about their next round, but you've got to be a little bit worried about the one after that. Curran, you're at a small company with a little bit of venture. How does it feel in the C-suite there?
I think it's the common theme of all of this is if you have good data, it'll drive everything quite well. If your data is not interesting to investors, then that'll drive it a different direction. But I think companies are all being mindful of how they're managing their capital at this point, and focusing investments on programs that they think are the most valuable to patients and the most valuable to their investors. I think that there will be a bit of forgiveness on certain timelines around COVID, this second half of the year. But as you said, I think things are starting to come back, and missing timelines or delays in studies will not be looked upon favorably like they weren't before. I think you will find companies also assessing their portfolio very carefully to make sure that they're focused in on the right programs to continue development on, because there will be a cash bearing phase over the next year or so. People are going to be more careful on investing, as we are, in capital, manufacturing facilities, for example. But at the same time, you have to look at the long haul and make sure you're prepared for success and not end up falling short of that, because certainly we talked about big pharma. The appetite of big pharma for small biotech is very strong. And one of the best ways to remain independent is to be successful and have control over your own programs to the extent you can.
Tim, is everyone still paying their bills on time?
They are, and that's a good thing. Just a couple comments, Anthony, to both your comments and Amy and Curran's just a second ago. It's interesting on the fundraising side, and I've not seen the statistics on this, but a fairly significant portion was directed towards COVID treatments. Many companies jumped into the COVID research area very quickly and used that as an opportunity to raise money. And I think it'll be quite interesting in the context of what Curran just said about good data. Is, I don't know the exact number, but it's in the thousands of things that are being tested either for treatment purposes, prevention purposes, diagnostic purposes, or vaccine purposes. And clearly, they're not going to all succeed. And in fact, most probably will not succeed. And so you wonder on the investment side how much you're going to be penalized for jumping into an area and coming up short, as opposed to staying more focused, on where your original mission was. So I think that's really important point. We have a couple of emergency use authorizations that we're preparing already, and you mentioned the remdesivir and things like that. There are some early successes, no question. Now, whether those translate into commercial successes is a very different story because of some of the pricing agreements that have already been negotiated. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out over the next 12 to 18 months, just from a drug development standpoint, but then at a higher level from a commercial standpoint.
I think those comments are spot on, Tim, actually. And what I'd like to do now is, we've already shifted from, basically ClinOps to finance, but I'd like to take it back to the regulator review. I think what we're seeing, as Tim's indicating, we're actually seeing three areas. I'm going to focus on two. There's therapeutics, there's vaccines, and there's diagnostics. I think we need more than an hour's discussion to sort out the diagnostics issue. So we'll just quietly push that one to the side for now, as everybody else seems to in the world. But in the cell and gene area, there have been therapeutics, okay, and I think, Wilson, I think most of them have been in this sort of mesenchymal type anti-inflammatory phenotype gestalt. You know, there's been a bit of dusting off of old programs and a few new ones too. And on the other side of the Silver Springs campus, I guess, is the vaccines field, you know, dominated by RNA, and also of what I want to talk about today is the you know, the resurgence of the adenovirus, which is in normal times, in peacetime, as they say. The adenovirus is a fairly humble candidate for oncolytics and a few other payload-driven therapeutic programs. But in wartime, as we are now, that family of viruses comprises a significant part of the vaccines effort. It all comes in your door, Wilson. Well, it doesn't all come in the OTAT door, right? The therapeutics do, but the vaccines are in another building. But what are you seeing? What's the volume like in these two areas?
So I'll comment on cell therapies, and when I talk about cell therapies, I'm going to include also the exosome products and other things that are derived from cells, and this is actually in some ways something that's positive that's coming out of the pandemic. As you know, we're very concerned that around the country there are many clinics that are administering cellular and cellular-derived products for a wide variety of indications without good evidence that these products do anything, and with concern that some of them may be unsafe. And that's, we've been struggling with that for quite a while. With the pandemic, some of these companies are coming forward and saying, okay, we're going to do some good research. We're going to do well-designed, randomized trials, some placebo-controlled trials, to see if our product can treat the patients who have COVID-19 in the hospital. And so we are seeing some folks step up and do well-designed research program to see if their products have activity. And I think that that's going to be good for the field. We also see other sponsors who are interested only in expanded access or compassionate use and aren't interested in doing research with their cell therapy or exosome products. And that's, we understand the feeling that if you believe your product works and can help patients, you want to get it out there. But at the end of 3 months or 6 months, when we get through this first or second wave, we need to know what works for patients. And the only way we're going to get there is through good research. So I'm pleased to see that some companies are stepping up to do that. So I think that that's something that's good that's coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think, you know, the FDA, perhaps out of all of the world's regulators, the FDA has been under the spotlight most for, you know, the seeking of reassurance that while a pandemic is a different situation to one in which we normally live, there are some constants in the role of the controlled experiment and basic societal requirements for demonstration of safety and efficacy for therapeutics.
Right, and as part of that, and I'm sure everyone's quite aware, what we're also seeing in the pandemic is unprecedented international collaboration and companies working together. We're seeing platform trials being put together for a variety of products, companies getting together, working with the NIH, working collaboratively because of the international emergency. And gosh, if we could keep that spirit going, that'd be wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Wilson, you inspect and oversee, from a regulatory perspective, facilities worldwide. And what's the FDA doing about that? What if I have a manufacturing facility in England and we need an FDA inspection? Is that going to happen? Are you going to use local resources? What's happening there?
So right now we're not doing international inspections. For a while we weren't doing domestic inspections either, but we've started doing domestic inspections. We look around to see what is the COVID-19 situation at each site to see if we feel like it's safe to go in at a particular time. Some products have been delayed in the Center for Drugs because they couldn't get the inspection done. And ultimately, those things will get done. We will catch up. But that is part of the delays that are occurring as a result of the pandemic. And we're considering virtual inspections, particularly for companies where the site has a track record. But if it's a site that is brand new and no track record, or if it's a site that has a bad track record, we're hesitant to do that.
We put out a white paper early in the pandemic on the subject of virtual audits. And honestly, it was something we considered prior to the pandemic and then fast-tracked because of the pandemic. And we carry an inventory of GoPro cameras, for example, which we can now give to locals and ask them to, please go to that filing cabinet and pull out the first folder from the third drawer. And we also came up with the concept of a conditional audit report, wherein we would authorize, we would bless the facility contingent upon a future reduced in-person audit, which everybody signed on the dotted line to say that reserved us the right to revoke the audit approval. There's any of the, I'll get free consulting from the panel now as to what you think. Would you buy that? Would you grit your teeth and hold your nose and buy it, or do you think that's the future? Anyone can jump in.
Well, I think we're going to think about working with, let's imagine that there's a site in Europe that can be inspected by the European inspectors. Is it possible that we could have an inspection by European inspectors with at a time and have them U.S. regulators going along for a virtual inspection at the same time? We think about those things. I don't know that we've done them yet. And would our inspectors who haven't done these things before be comfortable with the information that they're getting? I think it's going to be you have to do something some number of times before you're comfortable doing it. And we'll see how that evolves.
Curran, you're a career tech ops manufacturing chap. Would you go for that? Would you go for the virtual with a conditional blessing?
Yeah, I think about it a little bit. How often have I walked into a manufacturing facility that's well run but has terrible documentation? Almost never. So I think virtual audits, if you do a risk-based approach and the audit partner has the ability to send documentation in an efficient way, and you have experienced people doing this, I think you're going to get the same flavor of an audit very quickly from the level of the documentation. Do things thread well together? How are their metrics around on-time closure of open deviations? I think it's very feasible, and it's probably something we should have been doing a long time ago, including the collaboration aspect across geographies. But I think that it's something that should have been done probably more forcefully, and this will kind of push us over the edge to do that. And of course, you'll want to accompany that to the extent possible with imaging of the facility that you can see.
Yeah.
GoPro is well worthwhile to see if those practices are being adhered to see the overall cleanliness of the facility and the management of the material movement. But I think it's very possible that if you don't get a good impression from the documentation that you're working through, it's probably a bigger issue and you'll want to escalate that.
Yeah. And any of you out there who've still got our GoPros, send them back. We need them back. Okay, so you can't keep them. I mean, Amy, you're part of the yeah. Don't give them to your kids. Just buy them one. Amy, you're part of the your Vineti's product is just deeply embedded in the thing that's getting audited. Is it sort of a non-issue whether it's virtual or in person, or are there some subtleties there?
You know, well, certainly our piece of the chain, because we're enterprise software, is readily auditable, you know, remotely. But I would say that, you know, the overall system and in manufacturing, I'm not sure we've evolved as a species yet to adapt our remote techniques to get a full picture. Again, and I leave that to Wilson's expertise, and Curran, you're running a full program and manufacturing facility and managing manufacturing process. So, but certainly the software component is readily you know, interacted with and approved and audited virtually. So that does simplify somewhat. I think it's going to be fascinating to see as COVID releases its grip, and again, we assume a new normal, and we take some of the positive impacts forward and really, again, try to correct for the many negative impacts as well, to see how we adapt with technology to do more efficient remote work in general, including inspections. I don't think we're there yet, though. So I would be a little concerned about a full-scale inspection with only a remote access.
Yeah, Tim, do you see what from the CRO perspective? How's your audit world changing? Is your audit world changing, and how is it changing?
Yeah, it's been interesting to hear the comments, Anthony, because even before we think of audits, thinking at the beginning, so we do pre-study qualification visits. Those are usually in person. We do initiation visits, they're usually in person. We do monitoring visits, they're usually in person. We do closeout visits, they're in person. And then you have the audits that cover all of those areas, which historically have been in person. And from a company standpoint, CTI does about 90% of its work with academic medical centers. So in some ways, I feel a high level of confidence with some of the most prestigious institutions with the best practices of taking a lot of that stuff remotely in a creative way has been described by everybody. But on the other hand, just to be a devil's advocate, those are some of the institutions who financially have been hit the hardest. And in many ways, they furloughed employees. They went work from home and are trying to do, you know, the research coordinators aren't actually in the clinics or in the hospitals or things like that. And so in some ways, I think Amy said this best, I think the new normal likely will be some combination of on-site and remote. But I have to say, like, even getting access to electronic medical records at some of the most prestigious organizations has been really challenging. They did not have those processes in place, and they've had to really on the fly kind of develop what I think are not going to be permanent processes, but are temporary processes that hopefully lead to permanent ones. But I think it's a really important topic, and one that, you know, this group could certainly influence. And I like your thinking with the GoPros and things like that, of how you develop best practices, and developing white papers and things like that will go a long way.
Yeah, I think that's a a very interesting commentary. It's a terrible time to be new. I think, I think a lot of Wilson's, the companies with problems coming to Wilson at the FDA, probably a news to the block, opening a new organization, going for your first round of venture funding. I think it's a bad time to be new. I think where you're heading really, Tim, is that you can actually, to put it in a slightly derogatory fashion, dine out on your reputation for a little while here if you already have a good reputation. But I feel very bad for anything much new right now, unless you have something new which will directly impact the pandemic, in which case I don't feel in the slightest bit sorry for you. I just wish you would work harder. So I'd just like to wrap up with a final round of questions, which I think is something that emerged from my one-on-one discussions with the panel as we were preparing for this meeting. These adenovirus vaccine candidates are essentially viral vectors. Again, in peacetime, as I said, not the most popular family of viruses, but certainly being manufactured in facilities where the most popular families of viruses, like the AAVs of this world and the retrovirenses of this world, are being manufactured. If one of these vaccines gets a partial approval, and a mere 2 million doses have to be pushed out, I think that is going to suck out so much of the oxygen in the manufacturing room in a field which is already notorious for lack of capacity, lack of, shall we say, best of breed quality systems, and an area which has been sort of forced to expand extremely rapidly in recent years in any case. I worry about this, and I worry about it from many perspectives. Curran, you're actually developing some of these viral products. What does it look like from where you're sitting?
I think Dr. Bryan hit it on the head with, the smaller groups, smaller companies that are working virtually are going to get hit the hardest by this. Big companies that are doing the same type of work, like Pfizer, have published that they have 8 2,000-liter reactors ready to go, internal capacity. So they're going to be able to make it through this less harmed by it, if you will. And so all you can really do is, if you had plans to build, continue on and hope you can get equipment. That's a real challenge right now. The bioreactor market is very tight. The lead times for all of these things are going out in time. I think, it's incumbent as well. The one thing I would worry about as well with the vaccine piece is people haven't had time to develop optimal processes for these different therapeutics, and they're not likely to be optimized and not likely to yield as high as you would like in terms of number of patients treated. So it's going to be one where you have to plan and get commitments and make commitments early, much earlier than you would have originally, to try to secure what you can in terms of outsource capacity. And you may need to rethink, if you've decided not to build your internal capacity, you may need to rethink if that can be expanded or started, because this isn't going to stop next summer. It's going to be going on for years with the capacity issues that are presenting.
Wilson, you must be thinking about this in terms of, if nothing else, in terms of inspection staff. The chaps in uniform must be booked up for months now.
Well, they're sort of all on hold in some sense, that, and we're worried about, okay, when we can do inspections again, which ones are we going to prioritize and how are we going to prioritize them? Because we will be backed up. I want to say also, we've been pushing folks to get their manufacturing in shape earlier. By the time they get into the clinic, we need them to have paid much more attention to their manufacturing and not put it off till phase 2, phase 3, because we think that some of these products are going to look like they're effective in their phase 1 trial. And it's really hard to get your manufacturing in line when you're in a long line to get the manufacturing done. So it's really going to be a challenge for the small companies and the academicians.
Yeah, Tim, I mean, no drug, no trial. I think the capacity crunch is something which affects you tangentially, but you must be looking at the horizon and wondering when that wave is going to, come to shore, right?
Yeah, I mean, as you and I spoke, Anthony, I think going into the pandemic, we had some struggles with capacity on behalf of biotech and biopharma companies, especially in the immuno-oncology space, where frequently you have a very narrow window to enroll somebody. They have to be sick enough to qualify, but not too sick. And we've had experience over the last year or two where we've lost a number of subjects to a trial, being able to participate in a trial because we did not have manufacturing capacity. And so I think to your point, with the growing interest, investment, and success in cell and gene therapy, coupled with the COVID environment over the top of it, I think we have an acute shortage already of manufacturing, and it's likely to only be exacerbated in the future. And I think the previous two comments were right on mark. As Curran mentioned, the Pfizers and J&Js of the world, they will be able to figure a solution, but for many in the small company realm, it's going to require great relationships and a lot of foresight to make sure that you're in a position that you don't get hurt by it.
Amy, Vineti's products at least have the potential to squeeze efficiency out of the system. You must feel the ability to contribute here.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd say that, I mean, we still have huge hurdles to overcome, right? But the reason our company was created was to help create and promulgate standards so we could begin to set a framework to industrialize. And so we can't meet all of the supply shortages, where they are today. They're real and they're growing and they're exacerbated by the COVID situation. But this all gets back to the same premise around bringing down costs and simplifying process wherever possible if we're ever going to achieve, quote, standard of care or true new market status. It's so interesting and prescient as it turned out. But just earlier this year at JP Morgan, we had a small event at our office with Dr. Andrew Badley, who's an infectious disease luminary at the Mayo Clinic, now also focused on cell therapy. And, it was noted at the time, and he did talk through some of the vector shortages and that, especially because he was in a specialization that really wasn't getting any focus from cell and gene therapy and was being outbid by rare disease and oncology. So it was such an interesting, ironic set of comments. So I think the demand on, especially in a pandemic environment, on these therapeutics or vaccines, even call into greater relief where there are shortages or where there are opportunities for more efficiency and more simplicity overall. So I think there's tremendous opportunities. I mean, we've already identified some lower hanging fruits on just the process level. I think some of the supplies, like the vector front, again, are going to continue to be really challenging. We know a number of entrepreneurs are looking at disruptive technologies on this front. They're still early in their investigations. A lot of folks are aware of the problem, which I guess is a step one, but still many hurdles to come. We have to solve together.
The title of this panel is The Lasting COVID-19 Impact on Cell and Gene Therapy. As we start the wrap-up process, I'm going to ask the panel to consider in their minds the single most significant lasting impacts that they see from where they sit. I think we've already highlighted many good things which have come out of the pandemic with a sense of irony and perspective notwithstanding, I think more people know what is a phase 3 clinical trial than ever before, which essentially has rendered me completely useless at dinner parties. Not that I was much use in the first place, but on that basis, I'll start with Wilson, Bryan again. What's the lasting impact here from where you sit? Wilson, I think you're on mute.
Yes.
No Zoom meeting in this day and age will be complete without somebody speaking while on mute. So thank you for that, Dr. Bryan.
and sometimes folks would prefer that I were muted, but I think that the opportunity for collaboration, we've been pushing for collaboration for a long time for drug companies who are doing development to work with each other. And I think that spirit of collaboration hopefully will come forward out of this pandemic. And I'm optimistic that at the end of the day, that may be 1 year or 2 years from now, we'll have a much more efficient drug development process that will help us to get these products forward to patients.
Curran.
Well, we talked a lot about capacity, and just to end on glass half full, to build a plant nowadays with single-use technology can be done in 18 months. It used to take 3.5 years to do the same job with all the cleaning and steam in place that was there in the old systems. So that's, I think, going to help with this, how to get the couch with the snake, if you will. And I think also collaboration, I think, is another thing. There are companies that do have spare capacity. Are they willing to share it with those that need it for the better good of the industry and for the better good of patients? So I think that's going to be a question we ask ourselves in the same vein to what Dr. Bryan was referencing on collaboration.
Amy?
Yes. So again, thanks so much for having me in this panel. It's been delightful to be with you all, and great job emceeing us today too. Thanks so much. The emphasis, I think, on telehealth and remote distributed care will really benefit advanced therapies in the long term. I think about our cell and gene therapy ecosystem by its very nature is distributed and a challenge for traditional point of care clinical trial models. So I think that we obviously know how challenging that treatment journey is. It's so challenging. Entire sessions at multiple conferences have been focused on them, but I do think that there'll be some very positive innovations that come forward to help, again, bring our industry into more standard of care.
And finally, Tim.
I wanted Anthony to circle back to something that Wilson said very early. I look at trying to take the politics out of things like the Operation Warp Speed as being an example. I think it's amazing what's been accomplished when you combine the private sector and the public sector around a particular initiative. And it's unfortunate it takes a pandemic for us to happen. But when I think back to maybe, was it 6 or 8 years ago when we had Operation Moonshot that I believe was going to focus everything on cancer research and coming up with ultimate treatments and cures. But I just wonder if we can't, take this model, take some of the positive lessons, couple it with the technology advances and things like that, and figure out a way where and maybe it doesn't have to always be around drug development or regenerative medicine, although we're happy if it started there. But I even think that this kind of an approach could work for poverty or hunger or anything that's such a big problem. It seems like it's not achievable by a single group, is to think about how we are uniting with, I think great success, shortening processes, not having quality be compromised, and at the same time having sort of a united goal to ultimately get ahead of this pandemic. So I remain an optimist that some of these lessons learned are going to really impact not just drug development, but hopefully things beyond that.
Where we sit, we see if there's one tangible benefit that's going to come out of the pandemic, it is an increased appreciation, actually, as Tim said, both public and private appreciation of the societal value of effective, rapid, and innovative healthcare development. I don't think anyone on the planet is under any illusions about how important that is now for society and will continue to be for society. So I echo the comments from all four of the participants in that regard. This has been not only an interesting but an inspiring panel to chair. Again, I'm grateful to ARM for the opportunity, and we're all thankful to ARM for getting it together in the face of such headwinds. It's been my absolute pleasure, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing all four of you in person at the ARM meeting on the Mesa in a year's time. So let's all work hard and keep our fingers crossed for that. Thank you again, everybody.